You're listening to Kenny Mammarella-D'Cruz on the Men's Radio Station. In this week's MenSpeak Radio, I get to hang out with award-winning poet, author, teacher and ritualist William Ayot, who was recently featured on Radio 4 and in The Art of Manliness. Having worked in London's casino industry, William underwent a personal transformation and got interested in poetry, writing and ritual. He worked with the best of them, bringing the likes of Robert Bly, Michael Mead and Malidome Some to the UK in the founding days of the men's movement. Today, he's published 3 collections of poetry and a book about meaningful ritual, Re-enchanting, I got this wrong earlier, Re-enchanting the Forest. He's currently writing a book for and about men. So tune in to hear about grief and dissent in men's work, initiatory ritual, 7 rites of passage, and the use of poetry in the mytho-poetic movement. Wow. Check that out for multi-syllables. I got the initiatory right, at least. Sure. So over to you, William. Let's kick off with... So in the sound check, William read a poem, and I just thought, how can we not start with that? Because when I heard this, I felt it, and I thought, yeah, now I know who you are. Now I know where you're coming from. So, yeah, over to you.
The Iron Door. Between the absence and the love of war, there lies a space where sons feel incomplete, where fathers wait behind an iron door. The doubt that preys upon us more and more as we descend towards our sure defeat grows from the absence and the love of war. The song that leads us like a troubadour to risk our very lives when we compete sings of fathers shut behind an iron door. The tearing rage that like a carnivore devours the simple loves that make life sweet feeds upon this absence and the love of war. The shame that leaves us passed out on the floor, the drink, the drugs, the need to overeat beats with bloodied hands upon the iron door. The hurt, the loss, the grief all underscore the ancient father hunger sons must meet, owning the absence and the love of war, till they too stand behind the iron door.
Wow. So yeah, that floored me the first time, and I think it's floored me more this time. So what's your story and where does that come from?
Where does this come from? I'm 30 odd years down the line when it comes to men's work. I got involved towards 1990, late 80s, I think, and read a book called Iron John by a man called Robert Bly in America, and got involved in the work that he was doing. I joined men's groups. I was in recovery at the time for what they called adult children of alcoholics. My folks were heavy drinkers, and I paid the price. And one of the things I discovered later was that this is quite common amongst men, and it's quite common as, let's just call it, childhood damage. So I was with a bunch of guys and they wanted to work on their own, and I discovered that the work that they were doing on their own was entirely different to the work that I was doing in mixed groups, the work I was doing in recovery, and it was speaking on a slightly different level. It was using poetry, it was using ritual, it was going to deeper places, and I started learning about myself.
And that was in the UK or the US?
That was in the UK.
Right.
In those days, teachers would come over from the States or wherever that was, and they would go down to a place in Dorset or thereabouts, sometimes North London, sometimes elsewhere, and spend 4 or 5 days. And gradually, a group of 100 men would deepen the experience, and we would get to some very interesting places.
I wonder where those men are today, if some of them are.
Well, interestingly enough, I've been speaking to quite a lot of them.
Really?
Yeah. Guys that I first bumped into 1990. I led my first residential back in 1992, and spoke to a few guys that have been around since those early days, and they've gone on and led their lives in different ways. What is interesting from my point of view is that these guys did the work for nearly a decade, and then the tide ran out. It's as if people moved on. The teachers were doing different things. People were going somewhere else. Everyone was looking into other issues. The Enneagram came along, the this came along, the that came along. Whatever it was, different things came along. But I stayed with the work for quite a while. By this time I was leading rites of passage work in North Wales. And I moved on into the corporate work. And I did that for nearly 20 years.
So would it be fair to say that out of these, say, 100 men, most of them needed to do their own work to set themselves free to live their life?
Yes.
And that was not just catalyst, but community.
Yes.
That enabled them to do that.
Yes.
And how would you say things have gone since then? So they stopped, some teachers still came, or was men's work out of fashion, or it moved on to something else?
I think men's work was genuinely out of fashion. There have been some people who've continued it in the meantime and have been doing really good sterling work. The Mankind Project, Mandola up in North Wales, various different people. Lots of really good work, and it's gone out into the community. So I know guys who've been working with violent men up in Leeds or down in Plymouth. Really good guys who've been taking the work to where it needs to be done. There are others who've translated the work into other things. I started to work in the corporate field, in business schools and so on and so forth, in the belief that if I use the principles of the men's work, if I use story, if I use poetry, if I use ritual, and if we get to deeper humanity, a level of deeper humanity, that can only be beneficial to leaders and the people who follow them. That's my premise.
So it's kind of passing it on.
Yeah.
And in a way, is that what you are doing with the book that you're writing now?
Yeah. What I discovered, of course, was I had a couple of conversations with guys that really shook me and woke me up, because I had assumed they were going to have the same kind of broadly liberal, broadly middle-aged experience that I had. Not a bit of it. They were steaming angry. And they were filled with the most extraordinary beliefs and understandings, which I thought we had spent years working in a different direction. So something had been happening, and what I discovered was these guys had been online, and that there's a lot of stuff online that is sometimes questionable, sometimes out and out. What would we call it? Well, it's alt-right, really. Now, whatever your politics are, the reality is some of the things that are getting said, in both directions, from the Antifa, which is the anti-fascist movement, and the alt-right in America, it's just kind of getting extreme, and more and more and more extreme. So that got me to look at other things. And I began to realize that in the 30 years since I was doing men's work, we've had a sea change in our culture, in our lives, in the way we live. And that decided me to go back and have a look at men's lives now. So in the 30 years, the 30 intervening years since the beginning of the 90s, what have we had? We've had the moral triumph of feminism, let's call it that. We've had globalization, mass migration, the internet, climate change. Any one of those things has radically changed the way men perceive their lives. Whether you be thinking in terms of the old way of being a man, which is to be a provider, to be a defender, or whether it be to be a new man, to be going into. And at that point, a whole load of things came up and became questionable to me. So at that point I began interviewing men, and that's what I've been doing for the last 6 months, is interviewing guys around the world. So from Australia, New Zealand, through to the far west coast of the United States, Africa, Europe, and so on and so forth, just getting different stories. So that at that point I can then begin to say, well, and I'm beginning to realize that, yes, we are still all men, and we are all in this together, because the world's changing shape around us on a daily basis.
And do you find that we are in it together, or there are some clumps or tribes or communities of men who are playing a different game?
I think there are. Yeah, I think there are lots of different communities, lots of different cultures. The one thing I can be absolutely sure about, Kenny, is there's no one masculinity.
Yeah.
And when we start dictating what is a man, at that point the whole thing becomes unhinged, from my point of view. I've worked in the most intimate circles with men, and the one thing you can honestly say is that each and every man has a totally unique experience. He also, because of that unique experience, has a commonality with all other men. And that's the bit that is getting missed out at the moment. That our uniqueness, our unique grief, our unique pain, whatever that is, actually gets us to the point where, at a certain level, we're all in it together. We've all got skin in the game. And at that point, I think that we can meet and we can talk. And that's my hope. And that's the hope of the book. To do that, to have the conversations that we need to have with compassion.
And going back to the poem for a minute, what's your relationship, or what has been your relationship with your father, with other men? What's been your journey?
Well, basically, I grew up in a classic middle-class, white, rural family. And I was sexually abused. My father was an alcoholic, my mum a para-alcoholic, and things were not what they could have been. I was interestingly born without a roof to my mouth. So I was told, my parents were told I would never speak properly. I would certainly never sing. So for me to stand on the stage at the Globe Theatre and read a poem of mine to 1,500 people was like big stuff.
Well, Radio 4 last week, and the way that you speak, it's like you sound great. You've got presence.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. That's very sweet. But it was a hard road in that sense.
Yeah.
So my mother had yet to grieve the death of a previous child, and was unable to basically give me the nurture I needed. My father picked up the baton, and things got worse and worse as his alcoholism kicked in, and it got pretty bad. He did spot that he could try and change me, and by that I mean he sent me away to boarding school.
How old were you then?
He could, I'd have been 8, 9.
Right.
When I came back, he had changed to the point where he was on the slide, and the way he separated me from that point was he did some pretty appalling things, and that was to do with shaming me. That was to do with trying to create distance, and
so abandonment.
Not so much abandonment.
What do you mean by create distance?
Okay, here we go. I've never talked about this quite in such a public way, but here we go. I was heavy. I have been on and off fat and thin throughout my life, and he used to order me to strip, and he would scream at me about my body.
Oh my!
And he would call me names. He would scream at me, and it was pretty awful. And you're 13 years of age. That's really going in and hurting. So I've done an awful lot of work on this since, I have to tell you.
Yeah.
But the end result is that the cruelty that the drink supplied, and I still maintain that my father loved me and was a sweet man, and I kind of got through it to that point where I can say that. There was some real darkness in there. So I'm aware of the human condition in that sense, that the most loving men are capable of the greatest cruelties.
Yeah.
So that's where we can be. So on that level, I journeyed through that with a lot of men who have had similar experiences around their fathers, be they drunks, be they violent, be they sexual, be they whatever that is.
The spirit breaking.
And that's, generally speaking, a common experience, is that be it just the absence of the father, or be it, in my case, too much father, if you like, there is an issue with every man and his father, in the same way that there's an issue between every woman and her mother.
And man and his mother. And
yes,
so
which is the thing, of course, we get to later in life. It's easier to deal with your dad. He's gone anyway, you know. That's but you know, you got to really get down to work with your mum stuff, you know.
So you had, and the abuse was before boarding school.
The abuse was around the early years, so 7, 8,
right,
whatever. Yeah,
bag loads and cartloads of crap to take and do your work with.
Rage, grief, bewilderment, and a sense and a deep sense of shame.
And the way that we can kind of talk about it intellectually, the feelings of that boy at those ages with those things going on,
sure,
that's different. That's different to sitting here talking about it and putting labels on it. That's just absolutely huge and dark.
Yes. And of course, what you tend to do in those circumstances is you go inwards. You shut down. I built row after row of defences. And by the time I was in my 20s, I was totally isolated. I mean, I was the most defended person imaginable. I was completely cut off from everyone around me and myself.
Was it safe?
How do you mean?
To disconnect emotionally from other people and yourself, was it a kind of survival?
Well, I thought it was safe. I was in denial, but I thought it was safe. I was sparing. The odd thing was, I think I was sparing them me. I was sparing them this ghastly gunk that I was inside.
So are you saying that you were so self-loathing that you didn't want to spread badness by connecting with people?
Yeah.
It's darkness like this that I imagine would enable you to meet people there, to write from there, to sit with people there, and to allow them to move.
Yeah. There's a quality to the kind of people I worked with, and I would say all of them were wounded in not the same way, but in qualitatively similar ways. There's a quality there that you are able, because you've been through that dark night, you can spot it in other people. And of course you can say, I'm here, I'm at the other side of that dark night. It is possible. And for me, some of the most powerful experiences of my life have been seeing guys come out at the other end. When they've been able to manage really tough stuff in their lives, when you'd imagine they would go back into the hole, but they don't. Because they've done enough work at that point to be able to manage it, and they are a net good in society. The assumption that anyone who has bad stuff happen to them is somehow going to be in a tailspin and be a destroyer is erroneous. Most people who have horrendous experiences rise up against them and achieve great things.
And pass it
comparatively.
And I find generally the ones that go through it and feel through it and come out the other side, pass it on, not necessarily even in their doing, where a lot of people find purpose from unlearning, I guess, the dark shadow and revealing the gold shadow. But some people just quite simply pass it on in their being. And that's plenty. And I guess that's love. Earlier on, you mentioned the word initiation. What do you mean by initiation? And what have you, in all your years with
nice simple word, all right. So, I think a wonderful teacher called Malodoma Somé put it best. He said that initiation prepares you for the next round of trouble in your life. And I think that's as good as anything. So, historically, we've always had initiations. I say we, most cultures have had initiatory processes that move young people through to adulthood and thereafter people through to the different stages of their lives. We tend not to do that anymore. We tend not to have rites of passage, as they're called. What that means is that we end up with prime ministers in their 40s and their 50s who are behaving like and look like and act like boys.
Yeah.
Because they have no sense of themselves as men.
Yeah.
Now, that's a uniquely individual experience, but the reality is they're bimbling around like 15-year-olds and dragging us all along with them.
And they have a lot of power.
And they have a huge amount of power. And of course, they're charismatic, and they have all the things of what James Hillman used to call the flying boy, the puer aeternam. They're charming, they're gracious, they need to be loved, they need to be liked, and they are lethal at a certain level.
They really know how to make a noise.
Yeah.
Rouse the crowd.
Yeah. And that's a thing that I had to deal with. It's a thing that is part of our culture now, because we don't have those rites of passage. We don't have the experiences that take us out of our culture, put us into, for want of another word, an initiation hut, a place where we are separated. We are not then put through a transformative process. They used to call it an ordeal. But some kind of a process that then brings you back into the society. Now, in many indigenous cultures, when you've been through that process, you come back with a different name. You are such a different person.
Yeah.
So there we have situations where it's really important to know that we're making somebody into a different person. They're actually going through a change of identity, a change of belief systems, a change of self-awareness, whatever that might be. So it's a very deep process. Now, we like to think we can do it in 4 or 5 days because we're terribly sophisticated. but the reality is the indigenous cultures used to take about a year of that. And then they would physically scar people at the end of it to show that they had been through that process. That's an interesting thing. We don't do that. We just go out and self-initiate now. So at the age of 14, we start joyriding, we start getting into drugs, we'll pick up a knife, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other. We start playing with death.
Is some of that wanting a man to show up and say stop?
Maybe. Maybe it's challenging that belief that we've all had it at the age of 14, 15, 16. We're going to live forever. We are invulnerable. That's the love of war. That's the bit that sends us off to war, because we know we're going to live forever and everyone else is going to get killed. It's that bit of us. It's part of us, and that's a bit that needs to be met and ultimately challenged. But that's a job for elders, I think. And we tend to get to that through initiatory processes. It used to be in indigenous cultures that the moment a young lad started showing interest in the opposite sex or showing a sexual interest, they were grabbed and taken off to the hut, because that's the sign. That's the bit that does. Now, and at that moment they're separated from their mother.
Yeah.
So the big event is that they're separated in the Mayan culture, which is wonderfully explained by a man called Martin Brechtel. He describes saying he was a young man's initiatory shaman, and their first task when these kids were taken out of their home was to send them back into the home and steal their mother's cooking pot.
Wow.
So they'd steal the pot, and of course the mums knew exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah.
So they got a big stick ready, and the son comes in, steals the pot, whacks it over his head, starts going, and the mums are all beating the pot, whack, 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 whack. And of course that is the symbol for the boys are now going out. That's another round, and then they go through, and then when they come back, the last task of the initiation is to return the cooking pot to their mum without her knowing.
Wow.
And then they come back. And I think that's because they're returning as a man. They're not. They're not going to be welcomed home as mum's little boy.
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
That's the difference now. Yeah. And that is the primary process, I think, that goes on within a rite of passage, and we sought to recreate that in various different ways. I mean, quite a few people on both sides of the Atlantic and around South Africa and around the world have been trying to reconvene these sort of things. So groups of elders putting people through these processes.
And by elders, do you mean older men, or more experienced men, or men who...
It's an interesting point. theoretically, it would be the old guys in the village. But of course, in the village, the old guys would have been around about 40.
Yeah.
Because that's the way the world was back then. In reality, it is people who are wise enough in their lives to be able to hold ritual space. Because and that's not a matter of age anymore. That's about the experience with the work and whatever that might be.
Yeah, that's how I feel. It's like life experience and stage. And what you bring to the table is, sadly, I find so many men come to me, especially in the groups, with what's wrong with me and how do I do me right.
Yeah.
And they generally find out who they are and who they no longer need to be. And then they are present and connected to respond to life right, rather than doing anything. It's way beyond the act. Yeah. And we are almost way beyond time for a commercial break. So I should stop guessing, and we'll be right back after this note.
Great.
You're listening to Men Radio Station, where men really talk.
Hello, we're back, and it's just like too exciting and a little bit confusing because I'm dying to talk about ritual and all of that, which is what we agreed before I nipped to the loo. And then you two brought up the whole teens and self-initiation. And I wonder what that's all about, whether it's looking for, earlier on I said looking for boundaries, also looking for more. What is going on here and who am I? And surely there's more to this humdrum, it's, what would you say it is?
Well, if you want to get super simplistic about it, we could say that from the age of 1 to 7, a boy is in the world of the mother. From the age of 7 to 14, he's in the world of the father. From the age of 14 on, he's out in the world. He's ready to explore. He's as far as the psyche is concerned, he's well set up. He's naive, he's unproven, and he wants to try things out. And that's where boys find themselves at that point. And of course, they are also biologically mature. Or maturing. And at that point, everything kicks in. The testosterone, the this, the that, the other, and suddenly the hormones are ruling the roost. So there's an awful lot going on with a boy. And it's turned on very, very quickly. So suddenly you're in a different space entirely. The voice drops, the everything else drops, all sorts of things begin. Physical changes, hair's sprouting out all over your body, this, that, and the other. The hormones are going bonkers, and you're a different person. That calls for a communal response. Unfortunately, the communal response in our culture is to demonize young boys, men, as they're becoming, and to make youth the enemy. And that's not good.
It's so feared. It's outrageous.
That's right, and it's difficult because we're in a culture at the moment where boys are given messages on a daily basis that what they are becoming is bad. Now that's not good.
And it doesn't leave them any space to know what
doesn't give them any space, doesn't give them room to grow, doesn't give them room to experience who they really are without some degree of shame. And for me, the most toxic element in our culture, and of course I hold my hands up, I was badly shamed as a boy, but shame is the biggest damage that we can do to people in our culture. And that's where we find ourselves a lot of the time.
And I guess going into the dark, and it might be shame, but it's more about the vulnerability while being held by other men. Goes through this in a conscious, safe, we're on the same side, breaking open type way.
And we can begin to unpeel the layers of our feelings. So, for instance, I was talking about shame. Well, very often shame is so unpleasant, you will wrap it in anger. So, by coincidence, we've got an awful lot of angry men out there at the moment in our culture. A lot of angry men. A lot of angry men who are carrying an awful lot of grief around with them. So the shame and the grief gets wrapped in anger. Why? Because it makes you feel a bit bigger and a little less helpless and a little less vulnerable. So, you know, guys, we're all getting puffed up and we're getting angry and we're talking about politics and we're talking about this and that and the other. In the final analysis, we could look at how ashamed we are of what we have or have not done in our lives, and how full of grief we are about what's changing around us. You know.
So I wonder, with such raw, wild, I guess, enraged, creative energy, we go into ritual.
Yeah.
I mean, from the outside,
Yes.
that seems to be, so you're going to ask them to, like, do your side parting, we're going to church and we'll sort this out.
No, that's ceremony.
So,
I'm making there's a big distinction there.
Good.
So let's just put it like this. Ceremony, this is the way I would describe it. There are certain kinds of rituals, and I would call them ceremony, that really are about maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
So there are rituals that tell you the sun's going to come up, that are going to tell you it's now moving from spring to summer. There are rituals that tell you you were married, unmarried yesterday and married tomorrow, alive today, dead tomorrow, whatever that might be. Those are ceremonies. They are ceremonial.
For marking a path.
Yeah. Over time, they can become dry as dust. Those things. We like, I don't know how many funerals you've been to, but I've been to so many funerals that were empty.
Yeah. As an altar boy, I'd cry more than that.
That barely even acknowledge the presence of the person in the box.
Yeah.
It's like, very often the priest doesn't even know who they are. Now, that's not good. But that is ceremony. Ritual is something else. Ritual is a thing that meets you on sacred ground, whatever that be, however that's defined, but it takes you to a place where you are wholly authentic, you are real, and you are undergoing some kind of transformative experience. Now, at its best, the religious experience used to do that, and often for certain individuals can still do that, whether that be the Eucharist in the Christian tradition, or experience of going to the Kaaba in the Islamic tradition. Various different forms, whatever they may be, can be profoundly life-changing experiences. In a secular world, we don't have that. So my task that I set myself was to find ways of dealing with what I call the rituals of lack. What is it that we're missing in our culture? So we're really good at the beginning, the ceremonies, the beginnings, where we put a ring on our finger. That's a symbol. In a ritual, you are giving your soul, your psyche, a message. Now, the psyche doesn't think in data, doesn't do numbers. It's like a chicken, can't think, can't count. But it thinks in pictures. That's where we are. So that ring on my finger tells me I'm a married man. If I were to take that ring off my finger, that too is a symbol. So we, in our culture, we have really good rituals for getting into things, but not many rituals for getting out of things. So I've done rituals for people like guys returning from the army. They shave their heads and give them a uniform and train them and do this and do that and do the other, and that's all ritualized. And then they go off to Afghanistan, or they go off to Iraq, or they go off to Bosnia, or wherever the hell they've been, and they come back and they're given a check and they're said, thank you very much. Well, that's crazy. That's just calling for grief on a huge level of trouble. So to create rituals based on a story, on a myth, where somebody can come back and return from the wars with all their battle rage and all their shame and their grief and their anger, having seen their mates blown up and their friends destroyed and having done terrible things sometimes. So there's an opportunity in a ritual space to purge all that feeling. Once, twice, 3 times. Get to the grief. Get to the humanity. Get to that. And then they're safe to go back into the community. And not up until that moment.
This sounds a lot more than acknowledgement and emotions.
Yeah.
It sounds like it works on many levels.
Yes.
And it sounds like an incredibly sacred timeless, transformative space.
Yes.
That meets them at their being.
Yes.
And at the core of their, I don't know, that thin line between life and death, good and bad, dark shadow and gold shadow, or verging on insanity. Can you tell I've been there? And and that for me is the place of coming alive.
Yeah. And our culture militates against that. I'm going to read you a poem, because I can. You're a captive audience. It's called Man to Man. I shall spare you my pain, because I'm English, because I'm understated, because I am my father's son, and because the tipsy ghosts of our forefathers are floating in the air about us like a regiment of butlers, swaying slightly to and fro, eyeing me suspiciously. I can spare you my pain because I'm strong, because I'm practiced, because I'm a right hard bastard, and because the dogs I've kicked, like the women I've had, know that I'm well tasty, that I like a drink on Fridays, and if they want goodies, that's a part of the deal. I will spare you my pain because I'm numb, because I'm vulnerable, because I'm up against the wall, and because the wall holds back the boundless waters of my grief. If it gave, we'd all be swept away. But I daren't tell you that, because you're a man, and nobody trusts a man, ever.
Whoa.
That's what's working against us. Now, the funny thing is that a few hundred years ago, the people on these islands were described as a lachrymose and tearful people. We were highly emotional. We had very little emotional control. We were kind of like emotionally incontinent. This is a recent thing. This is 2 world wars and I don't know what. The stiff upper lip is something very new to us. So my take is that we can go back and that we can become emotionally continent, literate, and all those things. And that when we do that, we're a better benefit to each other. But it means that men have to sit in circles and they need to be able to hold each other's grief and be aware of each other's grief and not just do the stoical thing, which is fine if you are a Roman soldier and you're looking over Hadrian's Wall. Great. But it don't work when you're walking up and down Seven Sisters Road and it's all coming off.
Yeah.
We need something better than that in our culture, I would suggest.
Where would you suggest people go? I mean, obviously inside, but safely held.
Well, there are people who are doing the work out there. As you know, Kenny, there are people who are convening circles. There are people who are creating opportunities for men to do their work. Also, you can just start something off. Put a notice in your local tobacconist. There's the local Safeways or the local Tesco's got a notice board. Man looking to form a men's group. Put a phone number down.
I guess with that, I should plug mensgroups.co.uk.
Do it.
Because what I've done is the ground rules checking round and videos, so it's like, here it is, get on with it.
Great.
You need one other man.
Absolutely.
And that's where it starts.
Yeah.
And then there are organisations, you mentioned the Mankind Project.
Yeah.
And for the younger men, is it the Band of Brothers and Journeyman? Because
Band of Brothers, Journeyman, there are different things that are sprouting up all over the place.
Yeah.
They rise and they fall depending on who turns up. So if you get involved in something in your area, it's worth looking it up. There are also other things that are, it's interesting. Books tend to be very helpful. There's a constant flow these days of information. There is a constant flow of information that is just beginning to break again in the way that it did 30 years ago. For me, that's very hopeful.
Yeah.
I'm more hopeful now than I was 20 years ago.
Yeah. And you have been in and involved in a lot of ritual, a lot of initiation, witnessed a lot of transformations. Can you give any type of an insight as to what this means, what happens? Because a lot of blokes will go, yes, that's all well and good, but not for me, because it's just too scary. What is this thing? What goes on? Do you know what I mean?
Okay. Well, I haven't lost anyone yet. No one's died. what we tend to be afraid of is our feelings. In that poem I just read, the boundless waters of my grief, we're afraid that if we started to touch the grief, that we'd be washed away. Well, actually, you'll have 7 sticky, wet minutes, and then it's over, and then it passes through. And then it comes back again in waves, and it comes back again, and it comes back again. But the reality is you go through it, and if you allow it to process, it's a wave just like any other feeling. You know, we have them on a daily basis, and it's just our grief after a while. And once we become comfortable with that, and comfortable with the notion of that, we actually begin to enjoy it. You know, I had a good old cry the other day. That was really useful for me. It helped me, you know, it's the classic thing of just help me get it out of my system.
Let it pass.
Let it pass.
Everything needs to pass.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is... Now, it must be said, I'm 66 years of age, so it's an awful lot easier to cry than it was when I was 30.
Because
the testosterone is bleeding out of my system. I am older. The old joke about old soldiers crying is absolutely true.
right.
What happens when you are a teenager, when you are a young lad, when you're in your 20s, it is very hard to cry. The testosterone actually blocks your lacrimal system, or whatever we care to call it, your tear ducts. Now, that's a difficulty. Doesn't mean you don't feel. So the assumption that young men are unfeeling is erroneous. From my point of view, I know young men feel. Now, what that means is that they can process the feeling. They may not be, you know, tearful in the way that an old geezer like me is tearful, but they can work on it.
I find very often, and I'm sure you'll agree with this, Dactyl obliged, that a lot of men, or I was definitely not processing feelings. I was surviving, bricking over, and being safe. But I find as men are safe, or outgrow their lives, or are in too much pain, or just want more out of life somehow, then they show up. Men's groups or whatever it is. And then the backlog of feelings, beyond the stories, beyond the glory of it, beyond the shame, beyond the blame, they'll name it, they'll feel it, they'll feel through it, knowing that they might not survive. When I took the lid off, I thought 2 things will probably happen. Either I'll start thinking and I'll go bonkers and I'll be rocking in the corner, and it will all be happening very quickly inside it, but there'll be no connection to the outside. And the other one is I'll start crying and crying, and I'll never stop. And I'll go bonkers that way. It was too scary to take the lid off.
And the reality is you did neither. You had your thinking, and you moved on, and you wept, and you moved on. And that's the reality of our lives. And that's the indigenous experience, that's the tribal experience, that's the experience of people in different cultures around the world, is that you have a feeling, you process it, and then you get on with the next thing in your life. Our difficulty is that we hold on to those feelings and they become toxic. It's no coincidence, I believe, that suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50.
Go on.
You know, that's where we are now. And that's because we're not sitting in circles. We don't have the things in place to support each other. Going round the pub on a Friday night is all well and good, but it doesn't get you to a place of truth, and it doesn't get you to a place of authenticity, and it doesn't get you to a place where you are supported in your grief, savagery, pride, whatever that might be.
Sadly, I find so many men kind of almost don't exist.
Yes.
Not only do they have no idea who they are, because it's been surviving and the approval of others, but without any connection to anyone else.
And to sit in a circle of men and to be blessed. Now, for me, that was incredibly powerful. Bless them, quite a few of them are dead now, but the guys I sat in a circle with, who saw me, who actually said, I can see this in you and it's good, and they blessed it. That was the most moving thing imaginable.
Could you give an example of this so people kind of get what you're referring to?
I was introducing a bunch of people in the United Kingdom. One of whom was Robert Bly, and there was a man called Martin Prechtel, a Mayan shaman who was working with him at the time. And at the end of the weekend, or the 4 days we'd spent together, someone stood up and started talking about someone. And they were saying how this guy had done good things for them, and he'd done this, and he'd done that, and he'd done the other, and so on and so forth. And I was thinking, who the hell is he talking about? And all these people were smiling and looking at me, and I suddenly realised he was talking about me. And I'm getting super embarrassed at this point. And in the end, he stands up, and this guy, his name was Tim, he stands up and he says something really beautiful, and the whole room stands up, and they start cheering and applauding and this and that and the other.
I feel like crying even.
And I'm just kind of like, I'm beginning to wobble at this point. And at that point, Martin Prechtel did a very interesting thing. Is he ran in front of me, crouched down. He took my hand and he poured dried corn into the hand, and he closed my fist around it, and he said, "Remember this moment."
Wow.
And just moved on. Now I've got those corn in a little pot on my desk, and I know who I am at some level.
Wow.
And for me, those are the moments that you can get. And we talk about the grief, and we talk about the sadness, we talk about, but it's also the blessing. There's the compassion. There's to be held by other men when you are in your deepest grief, and to be told that's okay. To be held when you are full of rage and kept safe as you deal with something that happened when you were a kid at school or something. To go through all those moments and to be supported through all that, you come out a different person. And to me, those are the moments I will never forget. Yeah. And if I'm able to provide those for other guys, and in a circle, that's what happens. We can all work for each other. Then you're talking about some really, really profound moments in men's lives. And of course, that's what makes our lives. We don't remember our results in a company. We don't remember our, whether we ended up third or fourth on a league table of something. That doesn't matter. What you remember are the moments with your families and the people you love, and the people who love you. And the fact that men can actually express love in a benign and healthy way around each other, that's pretty good stuff. So for me, that's
being touched. It's real moments of life.
Yeah.
From being.
And at the moment, there's an awful lot of stuff about, men need to yang up. Men need to get tough. Men need to do this and that and the other. My belief is actually it's the opposite of that. We need to be able to access that deeper part of ourselves. And we need to stop taking that quality in ourselves and giving it to women. Oh, that's a feminine thing. That's a girly thing. What is it? Man up, says Arnold Schwarzenegger. Don't be a girly. Come on. Yeah, all right, I'll be a girly.
Which is fine as a stage that needs to go through.
Absolutely.
Go on.
Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And when you're in your 20s, and when you're unsure who you are, it's really useful to have those kind of warrior initiations, and that's where Arnold Schwarzenegger excelled.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff that he's talked about is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
This is a young guy coming from the backwoods in Austria, finally getting to the UK, finally getting over to America, and actually becoming something.
Yeah. Now, against all odds.
Can't knock that. Absolutely can't knock that.
And I kind of say, I wonder what you think about this, that for me the difference between a man and a boy is the man is not all about competition. The man can collaborate. The man isn't about survival. The man can live and create. The man isn't all about proving masculinity, because he is owned his own femininity and can come from there.
It's both and, not either or.
Exactly.
So it's about, for me, It's about accessing a broader concept of yourself. And that includes being able to, sit down with a bunch of young people and listen to them.
Yeah.
Not feel obliged to pontificate and tell them how important I am, but to actually hear what they have to say. I mean, I'm finding it really interesting at the moment, listening to younger people. The conversation I had last week on the radio was with a young guy who I had first met when he was 10, doing men's work. His dad was doing a fathers and sons weekend.
Wow.
And it was just wonderful to be able to sit and listen to his experience. And I think that I probably couldn't have done that 30 years ago. Because I was too needy, I was too wrapped up in my own self, as most of us are, I think, at different times.
Again, it's part of the journey.
Yeah.
It's not wrong or bad, but everything needs to pass.
That's right.
Let it go. I wonder what you might have brewing to hold some of this in one of your poems. Does anything spring to mind?
You want a poem?
Yeah,
Okay.
go on.
What have I got?
Kiss another geezer.
Yeah. What have we got?
Usually we ask for like 3 tips off the top of your head, but I think from you it's 3 poems because they're richer than tips.
Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to read you a couple of poems. Let me. If I'm going to read you the first one, and that's called "Counting the Marigolds." The fist came out of nowhere. He was 9 years old and running up the garden path, excited as only a boy can be when he sees his father coming home. "Daddy, Daddy, I scored a goal!" It caught him right on the button. Something split and he could taste the metal in his blood before he hit the ground. He was staring at a bed of marigolds, concentrating, counting leaves and petals, when his father picked him up and looked him in the eye. "I must have told you a dozen times," he slurred. "Never leave yourself open." So, that's kind of where we go.
Wow.
I'm going to read you a couple of other poems here because I want to read you a poem by a hero of mine. He was called Alden Nolan, Canadian poet. Died about 1985. He was a friend of Robert Bly, and he wrote, I think if I could honestly say if any writer was my guru, my hero, it would be this man.
Really?
Yeah.
Here's a quick question,
yes.
actually. Did Robert Bly write Iron John, or did he translate Iron
He
John?
wrote the book Iron John using the story Iron Hans, which was a Grimm's tale. So
Right.
he basically translated it, but then he wrote a commentary. So it was a bit of story, this is where we are today, bit of story, this is where we are today.
Right.
I was speaking to a guy recently who was in one of his original men's groups back in the 80s, and they used to sit around, they used to talk it through. So he was making notes basically on exactly these kind of conversations that you and I are having now.
Great.
So here's a little poem.
Go for it.
And it's about a kind of a lifestyle, and this is actually a story of a woman. It's called The Red Wool Shirt by Alden Nolan. "I was hanging out my wash," said the woman in North Sydney. "It was a rope line I was using, and they were wooden pins, the real old-fashioned kind that didn't have a spring. It was good drying weather. I could see the weir fishermen at work. I had a red wool shirt in my hands and had just noticed that one of the buttons was missing. Then I looked up and saw Charlie Sullivan coming towards me. He always had a funny walk. It was as if he was walking sideways. That walk of his always made me smile, except for some reason I didn't smile that day. He had on a hat with salmon flies that he'd tied himself to the brim. Poor old Charlie. 'It's bad, Mary,' he said. I finished hanging up the red wool shirt. And then I said, 'Charlie, it's not both of them.' And he said, 'Mary, I'm afraid it is.' And that was that. It's like dropping a little pebble in a bucket. And in a circle of men, if you read those kind of poems, That's where you get to. So I'm going to read a poem to finish, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's by a man called William Stafford. And it's called A Ritual to Read to Each Other. William Stafford was a genius. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood, storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park. I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep.
I think that is, unfortunately, the last one. Do you know what? I know we've only got seconds. Where would you send women, mothers of sons who don't have any men in their life?
Look for the books at the moment.
Yeah.
Really look for the books. Look for the websites. Look for your kind of stuff. And absolutely encourage mothers to send their sons along.
Brilliant. And on that note, time to go. See you next time. You're listening to Kenny Mammarella-D'Cruz on the Men's Radio Station.